Welcome back to Blueprint to Heal. Today, I am thrilled to have Dr. Stephanie Seneff on. We are going to talk about a very important topic that everyone should be aware of because it's something that's in our environment, it's in our food, and it's too many people aren't aware of it. So, thank you for being here today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I feel so lucky. I've had the honor of interviewing you many times over the years. And I, honestly, before I interviewed you the first time, I really didn't realize the significance of how serious glyphosate was. And because you are a scientist and you have been researching this topic for a very long time, I just trusted what you had to say. It wasn't like you weren't somebody I was going to question because your
Mm.
reputation and the references and all the information you bring to this topic supersedes anything we're going to hear anywhere else. So let's talk about glyphosate and particularly the research that you have done on that.
Yeah, it's a big topic. And as I should mention my book, Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment, that came out in 2021. And I had been studying glyphosate for almost a decade before that. And just to give a little background, I got interested in autism actually in around 2007 timeframe because I saw the rates going up every year, and the government thought we were just diagnosing it more, and it wasn't really a problem. But I thought it was a problem, and it had to be something in the environment. And I looked for 5 years before I came upon glyphosate. Fortunately, just fortuitously, because I wasn't thinking of it at all. Just like everybody else, I'd been told glyphosate's safe. It's a wonderful herbicide. Complete kills all plants, harmless to humans. I drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, I never used it because I don't use toxic chemicals. I pulled the weeds by hand in my yard. And I was really glad once I figured out it was really toxic that I had never used it. And I also hadn't been aware that it was all over the food supply. The extent of our content of our exposure is shocking. And then the fact that the government thinks it's completely safe, so they don't even bother to find out how much is in the food. It depends on activists like Zen Honeycutt to actually measure and find out, hey guys, there's a lot of glyphosate in these foods. So anyway, I had a lecture, a 2 hour lecture, a presentation by Don Huber, Professor Don Huber. He's over 80 years old and he's still active. He's still publishing interesting papers on glyphosate. So he's amazing. He gave a gripping lecture, and I didn't know what glyphosate was when I walked into the room. But by the time I finished listening to that lecture, I felt like I had found the answer. I mean, I really it was that clear because what he was talking about, the things that glyphosate does to the gut microbiome and how it depletes minerals, and these were all things that I was aware of that were being linked to autism, sort of that the issues with autistic kids lined up so well with what this chemical caused, and that I just thought this is it. I really came away thinking I got to study this molecule, and I did. I just did a deep dive. I read everything I could find on the subject, wrote a number of papers before I finally wrote my book. But it's a fascinating molecule, and it has really grabbed hold of me, and I'm hooked. So the biology is amazing, and it's terrifying because really it starts with the gut and it messes up the gut microbiome, and then it causes a lot of trouble with the colonocytes. The gut gets unhealthy. You get leaky gut. You get all kinds of nasty things leaking out into the blood and being produced by pathogens, and things get into the brain that shouldn't be there, and it's downhill from there. So I think very clear to me that glyphosate is the primary cause of the epidemic in autism. Not the only cause of autism, but the primary cause of the epidemic. That's how I like to say it.
Well, and when you think of neurodegenerative diseases, there's Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. I, I would think that there would be a connection with those diseases too, because they kind of come on slowly. And, we don't have the government or medicine really looking at that. I mean, I don't think they're really looking at the root cause, period. I think they're just looking to treat those problems. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And in fact, I did a lot of studying looking at statistical correlations between glyphosate and various diseases. That's one of the things I focused on for many years because I'm a computer scientist. I could go get the data, I could analyze correlations and get, statistical significance and all of that. And I've published a lot of papers with various graphs in them, lots of them. And I've got a huge list now of diseases that are going up dramatically over time, exactly in step with the dramatic rise, because glyphosate has been going up exponentially. Our exposure has been going up exponentially through the food supply. And that's what's really frightening. And so Alzheimer's, ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, that's the prion protein, um, Parkinson's disease, autism, all of those, and even ADHD and sleep disorder. I mean, there's a lot of different brain related diseases that are going up in prevalence over time, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate. And I think it's causal in all cases. People scream back at me, causation. Correlation is not causation. They were screaming it at me. All these people were saying, oh, ignore it. How could it possibly be true that one chemical could cause so many diseases? These kinds of arguments were pushed back at me. And I think it's true. To this day, I think it's true. Glyphosate is the primary cause of the epidemic that we're seeing in a huge list of diseases. And of course, not just the brain, because you've also got the gut problems, all the different gut problems we're having, celiac disease, and there's certain cancers. Only some cancers have been correlated very strongly, but thyroid cancer and pancreatic cancer are two of them. So it really messes up metabolism, and it hurts the mitochondria in a big way. And mitochondrial disorder is a feature of almost all of these diseases, probably all of them actually. Mitochondrial dysfunction, and that's the thing that glyphosate is causing, mitochondrial dysfunction. I think if you have to pick one thing, that would be it.
So I do want to mention that glyphosate is in Roundup because there may be people listening or watching that have no idea what glyphosate is, but most people
Right.
know what Roundup is. Is it in any other product besides
Oh, there's
Roundup?
a lot of different formulations. I think rodeo is one of them. I don't actually know the names because I don't come across the actual formulations, but I know there's a whole bunch of them, different ones that you can use, like in the aquatic environment, they've got something, and then on the maybe something more toxic that's used on the weeds compared to what you buy at the local garden store to kill your dandelions, probably more toxic formulations. I don't know, but there's many different formulations, and of course the formulation matters as well. And that's one thing that Professor Seralini in France has a group, and they've done a lot of studying of glyphosate and the various formulations, and they were really the ones who made people aware that the formulations are actually much more toxic than glyphosate by itself. Because not only because they increase the opportunity for glyphosate to get up into the cells, and that's how it causes damage. The formulations have surfactants and things in them that help the cell to take up in the plants, but also in the humans, and in the gut microbes to take up the toxic chemical. But they're also, some of those components are intrinsically toxic as well, and actually acutely much more toxic than glyphosate. And this is something Seralini showed, that these extra components that they put in there are not benign. And when they studied it to get approval from EPA, they didn't use any formulations. They just used pure glyphosate. So they managed to hide that additional toxicity that's due to the formulation. They hid that from the public and from the government, because they got through the studies by not showing glyphosate's true colors, because they did not use the formulations. And in fact, when they studied the GMO crops, I was really surprised to find this out, to evaluate whether the GMOs are safe, because they've modified the plant. This is how they can use it, spray it all over the crop doesn't die, because the crop has been engineered with a microbial gene that is insensitive to glyphosate. So it's a gene copy of a gene that's really important for the plant. The plant has its own version of that gene, but the microbe has a different version that's not sensitive to glyphosate. And they put that version into the plant so that it doesn't get nearly as badly affected by the glyphosate. And so the plant thrives, everything else dies, and you have a really easy way to control the weeds through those GMOs. But they studied the GMOs. When they studied them, they grew them organically. They didn't put any glyphosate on them. How can you judge, because the glyphosate actually messes up those plants. And of course, the glyphosate itself is part of the problem with the GMOs, because the GMO foods end up with glyphosate in them. And they ignored the glyphosate completely, didn't even use it when they evaluated the safety of the GMOs.
And that's a huge problem that you and I both know in, you know, science, right? I do that with quotes, air quotes, because scientists can manipulate studies for them. Like if they know what they want the outcome to be, they
Exactly,
just
exactly.
manipulate the study so they get the results that they want.
Absolutely.
So, the other thing is, I don't know, I think it was about 25 years ago, I saw a documentary on cows and how their intestines were getting destroyed. I believe it was from glyphosate that.
25 years. It was around, but it wasn't used that much in those days because they didn't have the GMO crops.
Okay.
Um,
But I remember maybe it was less than that, but I
well, actually,
remember,
they were just coming out. 25 years puts you back at 2000. And actually, they did have the GMO crops. That's when they were first rolling them out. So, yeah, it could be.
yeah. And I remember from this video that they were talking about how the animals were constantly getting sick and, they were having all these intestinal problems. And there were two things that stuck out. One is if they had to kill the animal, they would then feed it to other animals, right? So they're taking this disease, cow or whatever it was and feeding it. So that was one thing that really stuck out to me. But, just the farmers were saying that when they remove glyphosate, that their cows all got healthy and they didn't have any
Yeah.
problems after that. But then they're
And
fighting with the government because the government wants them to spray everything, which includes the feed that these cows were having.
they have much higher levels allowed in the feed than they do for human consumption. They allow the animals to get much more poisoning than they allow the humans in terms of the regulators, like 100 times, well, at least 10 times more, maybe even 100 times more that they allow on the animal feed. The animals are all being poisoned by the glyphosate. And in fact, Don Huber published recently a very interesting article with some collaborators about cabbage. And it was organic cabbage. And the cabbage was grown with manure, and the manure came from chickens and turkeys. And the manure actually had lots of glyphosate in it because the chickens were being fed glyphosate contaminated feed. And that glyphosate in the manure actually ruined the crop. So the crop, the cabbage didn't have the right structure. And when they made they were selling sauerkraut from this crop. And when they made the sauerkraut, it was mush and it was inedible and they had to throw it away. And they lost a huge amount of money, these farms. So organic sauerkraut contaminated with glyphosate from the manure because you don't have any restrictions on what kind of manure you can use. So even the organic farmers have to be careful. They get it in the rain too, because I tested a sample of water. I sent it to Anthony Samso, my collaborator, and he tested it for glyphosate and found glyphosate in the rainwater that in Cambridge, my office in Cambridge. So it's in it's in the rain, So you can't keep it out of the organic crops. And that's why they sometimes come out positive. But you have to start worrying about what manure, your source of manure for your organic crop. So we need to really get rid of it. And we can't just, certainly I encourage everybody to buy certified organic. That's what I do. When I shop at the grocery store, I always look for that label. And if I can't find that label, I find something else to cook, because if I can't get an organic version, and sometimes we have to shop around quite a bit to find what we're looking for. We take our time and do it right. My husband and I are very serious about eating certified organic.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because that was one thing I hadn't even thought of because I only buy, from local farmers markets. I'm lucky that there's a regenerative farm close by where I get my meats, but I hadn't thought about the manure to fertilize the soil for vegetables. That hadn't even occurred to me. So there's another thing to ask my local farmer. Um,
Yes.
so
It's
have you,
hard for farmers here to do the right thing because there's so much wrong around them that they can't really avoid. I would find that very frustrating if I were a farmer, that I can do my best to make my product really, really good, but I can't control certain factors, that are
yeah.
part of the systemic environment in the world today, and especially in the United States. I think Brazil and the United States are probably the worst offenders as far as the use of glyphosate relative to the population.
Yeah, so one of the things that recently came out with Zen Honeycutt's study was, these packaged foods, and she tested a lot of them. And, the Girl Scout cookies and all the stuff with really high levels of glyphosate. And the one that, yeah, I haven't eaten Girl Scout cookies in years, so I was fine with that. But she found this chickpea pasta had a very high amount
I
of
remember that.
glyphosate, and I was so upset because that was the brand that we were using.
Oh, yeah, that's really
So
sad.
it was
And
just very
when people
disappointing.
have gluten intolerance, they often switch over to these legume-based products, like these bean, noodles and things like that. And the beans are really, really contaminated. This is something that Canada found out because, and I like to talk about my friend Tony Mitra, who he's Indian born, but he's a Canadian citizen, and he harassed the Canadian government for years to finally get them to do the tests. And they tested like over 8,000 different food samples for glyphosate in the Canadian foods, U.S. foods, Mexican foods, European foods. They everything imported into Canada, and they found a consistent story, which was that the United States and Canada came up with the highest levels consistently of glyphosate on their products, and Mexico lined up pretty well with Europe. So both Mexico and Europe had generally much lower levels of glyphosate, but the legumes were sky high. They were probably the worst. And oats, legumes, and of course wheat, these are all sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest. Non-GMO, they're all non-GMO. So some people think, oh, good, non-GMO, I'm safe. No, sometimes it can be even higher levels of glyphosate in a non-GMO food than in a GMO food because of being sprayed right before harvest. They use it to desiccate the crop. They spray sugarcane too, so the sugar ends up with glyphosate. And they use it right before harvest. In fact, the sugarcane workers in Nicaragua and in Central America are getting a really nasty kidney disease, and they're dying in their 40s from a
Wow.
strange kidney disease. And I think that's a direct hit that glyphosate is the primary cause of that problem that's ruining their kidneys. And they harvest the sugar right after it's been sprayed with glyphosate. So they really get up close and personal into the lungs, and it's just bad news.
Yeah, I started buying pasta from Italy because, from my understanding, they don't use glyphosate.
They do, but it's much less. And also, I also buy from Italy. I actually raise the bar Italian pasta organic, so I
Right,
go for broke. But I do think it would have less. I just think the Europeans, they use a lot less, and that's why they have a lot less in their food. So in general, when you buy from Europe, you're better off. And even Mexico, I would say if I was forced to buy something that wasn't certified organic, I would look for something from Mexico. And Mexico is banning glyphosate. I mean, they've really been stirring up trouble for the U.S. and we've been fighting back, and Monsanto's trying to do lawsuits or trying to, get them to not do what they want to do because they're banning imports of GMO corn from the United States. Corn's a big deal in Mexico, so they have all those tortillas,
right.
and they import a lot of corn from us. And our corn is almost all GMO Roundup ready. And the Mexican government has been really on top of it. They have gotten very concerned about glyphosate, and they are pushing hard to regulate it and to disallow imports from the US. And the US is screaming at them because we can't stand the thought that they won't buy our corn. Instead of thinking maybe we should make our corn organic, it's like we can't let Mexico do this. So it just reflects. I hope our government will change its attitude now that we've got RFK Jr. at the helm of HHS. I think that's going to have impact.
I was just going to ask you about that. Now that Bobby Kennedy Jr. is head of HHS, it just seems like, from what I'm following, that there's still, I don't know if it's a bureaucracy or what, but it seems like to peel through those layers. And, like I read somewhere that I think it's Bayer that would like to have immunity from lawsuits, right? Because,
Oh, I know. That's something that Zen Honeycutt is really on top of. And she's been really encouraging people to, sorry to interrupt you, but
no,
it's
it's
really
okay.
excited me because she has really made me aware as well of this they're a systematic attack. I mean, Bayer is working state by state, and there's like more than a dozen states, I think, that are considering passing. They have these bills that Bayer is helping them to prepare. And I should say Bayer that is now Monsanto. Monsanto got bought by Bayer, and so
Right.
Bayer is the owner of this glyphosate, and they're trying to get to use the argument that glyphosate is so essential for our crop production that we can't afford not to have it. And if they get all these lawsuits from all these non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cases, they're going to have to stop making glyphosate. And if they do that, we're going to all starve. I mean, that's the argument they're using. So we can't let people sue the company if they get non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from their exposure to glyphosate, because that will cause us to not be able to supply glyphosate anymore, and people will starve. That's the argument that they use. It's kind of like the vaccine argument, I think. And
Right.
they did that with the vaccines in 1986, that the vaccines are such an essential part of our health program. We can't afford not to vaccinate our kids, and therefore we can't allow the vaccine companies to be sued if a child, dies 2 hours after the vaccine. That's fine, no recourse. I mean, they have this vaccine court, which is really pretty farcical because there's lots of kids who have developed autism shortly after a vaccine, and the parents have learned that they absolutely can't claim autism. It will not work because
Right.
they've got powerful lawyers that are going to fight that in the vaccine court, which is a U.S. based thing. It doesn't relate to the company at all. The company's perfectly fine.
Yeah, and they don't allow discovery. It's really just such a mockery what they're doing. Yeah, so then I think about this. If people really understood that, let's say that what Bear is saying is true, that people are going to
Mm,
starve. Well, people are dying. I mean, we have 60% of Americans are suffering with chronic disease.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
we have a huge number. And it seems like the cancer rates keep going
yeah.
up every year. And there's a couple factors that I think, Brian Hooker and I discussed this a few weeks ago on the podcast about how, you know, more and more Americans are getting annual flu shots and now COVID shots,
Right,
and they're
right,
getting the shingles shot and the pneumonia. And that's just another source of toxins that are being put in the body. But
right.
people also don't realize there's a lot of people that are, quote, organic, right? But will still vaccinate. And then there's people
Yeah,
that will not vaccinate, but eat organic, but they don't realize, as what we're talking about today, the layers of how somebody could be getting glyphosate and not realize it, or the effect
right.
that it might be contributing to Alzheimer's and dementia and, autoimmune and these chronic health problems that are really plaguing Americans more than any other country.
Absolutely. I mean, it's clear that we have a toxic soup problem, and it's not just glyphosate. I mean, I put a lot of blame on glyphosate, but of course, we've got a bunch of other chemicals too that are believed to be even more toxic than glyphosate. I mean, all these atrazine and 2,4-D and dicamba and glufosinate, those are other herbicides that are all considered to be much more toxic than glyphosate. So maybe they are. I mean, I think glyphosate is much more toxic than we realize, and it lines up with those others, but they're bad too. And so if we start banning glyphosate, we're going to start using more atrazine.
Right,
And atrazine is what caused male frogs to become females. They had XY gene, and were tadpoles developed into fully functional females, despite the Y, because
right.
of the exposure to atrazine.
Yeah. So what do we do? I mean, I guess these chemical companies are just so powerful. And
It is true. It's so frustrating that they know how to grease the wheels. I mean, they just give all the legislators lots of money, and that keeps them under control. It's very simple. I think the money is a huge part of the problem. Pay
yeah,
them off, and
I,
then they become unable to fight because they want that money. you know, and that's extremely frustrating.
I guess one thing we can do is encourage people to grow their own food. And if they don't have room to have their own farm, to at least get together with a few other people and share the land, share the expense, share the work. Even as far as having chickens, right? Chickens, that's something new. We just bought this property in October and it came with 8 chickens.
Oh, that's really fun.
Yeah, in fact,
There's lots of places. Yeah, there's lots of places where you can't have chickens, right? There's a lot of rules against having any animals other than dogs and cats.
right, right. So
But chickens are
maybe,
great.
yeah, so
Yeah,
if we can encourage people to do that, that's one way because I mean, again, I think I'm kind of hopeful having RFK Jr. at the head of HHS, but I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I mean, I don't mean
No,
to
I
be
know.
cynical, but
We're going to get impatient. So we expect immediate action, and it's just a slow process. Yeah.
and
And
I guess what we can do is ask people to contact their local senator, their state senators. And, if enough people, I mean, I do think there is power to the people. I think if we have
I
enough
think so
people
too.
calling their senators and saying, look, I'm not going to, donate to your campaign fund next time unless you start putting people first,
Right.
hopefully that can make a difference because they still need
Yeah.
people to vote for them.
Right. Well, the thing it's also frustrating when you look at obesity, which is another one of the conditions that I think glyphosate is causing. The solution to the problem is Wegovy, right? About these new meds that are GLP-1 analogs, and I've been looking into those, and so they cost like $1,000 a month, and then they're pressuring to get Medicare to pay for it, for example. So it's gonna break the back of the Medicare system because you can't afford to spend $1,000 a month on all these people who are obese. And worse than that is that it acts such that as soon as you stop taking it, you immediately start gaining the weight back. You become ferociously hungry and you can't stop eating. And when you lose the weight, you lose more fat. You lose more muscle than fat. And when you gain the weight, you
Wow.
gain more fat than muscle. So you become weaker, muscles become weak. And so you can, I know someone actually who was on Wegovy being paid for by the insurance for maybe 6 months. And then the insurance decided to stop paying for it because of course it gets expensive after a while. The insurance found a way to say, no, you don't have diabetes. We can't pay for this anymore. So he couldn't afford to pay for it by himself. So he stopped taking it. And then of course he gained the weight right back. So it's very frustrating that they think this is actually a good solution to the obesity problem. It's just so indicative of what our government, how they view the world in the wrong way. Rather than finding out what's causing it and getting rid of that, they just throw more toxic chemicals onto the
Right.
mix through the pharmaceutical drugs. And you get all these we have all these lifestyle drugs that you take for your blood pressure and your cholesterol, like statin drugs and the blood pressure drugs. Most adults are on these drugs for life, really, right? And that they love it because they can make a lot of money that way if you have to take it for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And they'll put a child on cholesterol lowering drugs, like put a 10-year-old on statin drugs, which is outrageous, expecting them to be willing to take the statin drug for the rest of their life.
Well, and the other issue is we need cholesterol to be healthy.
I
Cholesterol's in
know
every cell of the body. It's in our nerves. It's in, majority of what's in our brain.
huge amounts in your brain.
Right. So,
It's much more.
and
Yeah,
the cholesterol is coming from our liver making the
right.
cholesterol. It's not, the food that we're eating. So,
It is the food that we're eating, and I encourage people actually to eat high cholesterol foods, even for heart disease. I mean, this is
right.
sort of an outrageous statement, but some people go vegan because they don't want to get any cholesterol because they're so obsessed about the cholesterol levels in their blood. The industry has trained people to be really worried if they've got high LDL. LDL is actually protective; it actually fights infection. And cholesterol, for me, that what I believe is that the problem is not cholesterol, but cholesterol sulfate insufficiency because of the sulfation system being messed up by glyphosate. And so cholesterol sulfate is water soluble and it goes into the membrane of the lipids and it actually protects the lipids from oxidation damage and from glycation damage. So you have these LDL particles, which are like these little lipid droplets that are in your blood. That's what they measure. And if it's high, they put you on a statin drug. Those particles have cholesterol sulfate around them. And the sulfate gels the water around them and creates a shield that protects them from damage from the other things in the blood, like the oxygen and the glucose. And so when you don't have enough sulfate, the LDL particles become vulnerable to attack. They get oxidized, they get glycated. That's when they're troublesome, and then they'll accumulate in your arteries and block your arteries and all of that because there's not enough sulfate. I think sulfate's the critical problem there. And cholesterol is essential. It's so essential that the last thing you want to do is to try to keep your liver from making it. You're
Right.
going to get sick.
Yeah.
And
And
so it's just a good
uh,
example of how they mess things up.
well, and I was going to say, if you look at side effects of taking statin drugs. Like two of the top things are memory loss and confusion. And
Yes.
as I had mentioned on another podcast interview that I did, my mother was diagnosed with early dementia like 15 years ago. I didn't know she was on a statin drug. She hid it from me because she knew how I
Uh,
felt about it. And
right.
my mother was sharp as a tack before she started
Yeah.
taking this.
That's so sad, isn't it? It's so sad.
And it was interesting. And the other problem that I see is that the doctors kind of, they blackmail you, right? They're not going to see you if you stop following their recommendations. And my mother, she just passed a year and a half ago. She was
Mm.
91, but she, put her doctor on such a pedestal that she wasn't going to go against him, whether it was getting her annual flu shot or getting a
I
statin
know.
drug.
I've heard people say that. They say, "Well, my doctor says I have to, so what can I do?" And I said, "You don't have to listen to your doctor." But people really are. Many people think, "Oh, if my doctor says I have to, I better do it," right?
Yeah.
Without even thinking about it. It's my doctor's opinion that I should do this, and therefore I will. I've never been particularly fond of doctors, and so I don't necessarily follow what my doctor tells me, you know.
I
But
stopped following them about 35 years ago when I realized that they were the cause of my GI problems and my chronic illness. But
yeah,
but it's interesting. I went to appointments with her to try to convince the doctor to stop prescribing the statin drug, for instance. I said, what's the point? She doesn't have a history of heart disease. She doesn't have a family history of heart disease. She's totally healthy. She was in incredible condition. She used to walk every day. She really took good
yeah.
care of herself. And he said flat out, well, if she doesn't take it, then I'm not going to treat her anymore.
Oh my, that's awful.
It
That's so
was
awful.
horrible. And it
Yeah.
took about 3 years to convince him to stop prescribing it. And then I used to
Yeah.
go into her place and I would take the bottle and throw it away. But then she realized she was out of it because she was so used to taking it and that she'd get more.
Yeah.
And
Oh gosh.
so that and the flu shot, I took her a couple of
Yeah, I
times,
know.
and it's like, she has to get the flu shot or else she can't be in my
Right.
practice. And I'm
That's
like,
awful. I didn't realize they were doing that to adults. I knew they were doing that to kids because, in fact, they get a reward of a certain percentage. I've heard that the pediatricians get some kind of bonus if they're a certain
they
percentage
do.
of their patients are fully vaccinated. That is so awful. And so then and in fact, I even had that same experience with my daughter-in-law that their doctor, she wanted to stop doing the vaccines because her kids were getting harmed by the vaccines. And then the doctor refused to. He threw them out of the practice and she had to go find another pediatrician.
Yeah, they get
And
$400 per fully vaccinated child in from Blue Cross Blue Shield. I don't know about the other
wow,
insurance companies, but they have to have 63% compliance in the
there you
practice,
go.
or else they don't
Yeah.
get any of it.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. That's why they really pressure the people. And if someone is not going to comply, they just kick them out. And the fact that they have the right to do that is so annoying because you don't obviously want to be with a pediatrician who's opposing you like that anyway. And so you end up having
right.
a hard time even finding a doctor who's going to go along with you. It's so frustrating. That's going to change. I mean, I'm really hopeful that the true message about the vaccines is going to come out in the coming years.
I am too.
It certainly has come out in my community, but it's sort of slow to make it to the mainstream. But
So I want to go back to mitochondrial dysfunction. I should have probably followed up on this question earlier because we're taking a big circle back. But can you describe what that is and how would somebody know if they have it?
yeah, well, so the mitochondria are the source of energy. They're the powerhouse that makes the ATP, and the ATP is the energy currency of the cell, adenosine triphosphate, and the mitochondria make it, and they make it by burning glucose, for example. So all the foods that you eat get converted into acetyl coenzyme A, and that goes into the mitochondria and gets metabolized to water. So, you have oxygen gets converted to water, and then the food gets converted to carbon dioxide. So you're basically this famous, you know, reaction that takes place that turns food into carbon dioxide and water using oxygen as an oxidizing agent, and it's a really fancy pathway in there that does that. and but that pathway is very sensitive to toxic exposures. And so there's lots of toxins that get into the mitochondria and cause trouble. And the main thing is they cause reactive oxygen species, it's called. So that the mitochondria, that whole machinery stops working very well. And when it doesn't work well, it makes less ATP, and instead it makes more reactive oxygen. Things, they call it reactive oxygen species like superoxide and hydrogen peroxide and things like that are going to cause damage to the cell. So when the mitochondria are working well, they make a lot of ATP and they don't make a lot of these reactive oxygen products. But when they're not working well, they do the opposite. And then when they get really sick, they die. And when the mitochondria die, the cell dies. And so you can actually, for example, destroy the pancreas. So the diabetes is connected to problems with the pancreatic beta cells. And those beta cells, they make the insulin. They have a very stressful job, and their job generates reactive oxygen. So they're very sensitive to the reactive oxygen. They can die. And they have antioxidant defenses that help to sop up the reactive oxygen. So you have this whole balance between, like glutathione, you probably heard of glutathione, and that's a really good antioxidant that helps to sop up those things before they cause trouble. And that whole machinery can just get screwed up by various things, toxic exposures, so that there aren't enough antioxidant defenses anymore, and you've got too much reactive oxygen. It's kind of like burning a fire, you could say. The fire burns and then the cell dies. And so that's really the basis of most of the toxic exposures that you see. Now, glyphosate, so there's several articles that have shown that glyphosate causes mitochondrial stress, causes this reactive oxygen to get expressed, suppresses critical enzymes that are involved in metabolizing the glucose. And so, for example, succinate dehydrogenase is a super important enzyme in the mitochondria that plays a role both in the metabolism of glucose and in this oxidative phosphorylation, which is the thing that creates the ATP. Both of them is the only protein, the only enzyme that works in both of those systems and is super critical. And if it's deficient, you end up with cancer. It's a correlation with cancer to have a deficiency in succinate dehydrogenase, and glyphosate has been shown in multiple studies to suppress it. So that's just one example of an enzyme that gets in trouble with the glyphosate. I've seen the larger picture that I'm really excited about, and this has to do with deuterium. I'd like to introduce that to you. I don't think have I talked to you about deuterium?
Nope.
Yeah, so deuterium is heavy hydrogen. Hydrogen is the smallest atom. It's on the upper corner of the periodic chart. One proton and one electron. It just has one. It's the smallest. Like, all the other atoms have more. So, for example, 14, 12 in carbon, for example. So the hydrogen, deuterium is hydrogen with an extra neutron. And so most of the atoms have neutrons as well as protons. And neutrons are not charged, but they're the same weight as protons. So this is just a basic chemistry. But so deuterium is a hydrogen atom with an extra neutron, twice as heavy, which makes it very different from hydrogen in how it behaves. And deuterium is a natural element. It's found everywhere. It's present at 155 parts per million in seawater, which sounds small compared to hydrogen, but it's actually present at 5 times the level of calcium in the blood. So it's compared to the minerals, it's high. But compared to hydrogen, it's low. But there's so much hydrogen in your body, like something like 60% of your atoms are hydrogen atoms, maybe more. I should get that number, but I know it's a lot. It's a tiny little atom, but there's a ton of them, and they're very important for all the reactions that take place. They participate in all the reactions. And so the whole thing that happens in the mitochondria with the ATP, making the ATP with the ATPase pumps, depends upon what they call proton motive force, which is hydrogen atoms. They're actually positively charged hydrogen atoms, which is protons. They just have the proton, they don't have the electron. And those protons actually go charging across a membrane where the ATPase pumps sit, and the ATPase pumps use those protons as a force to generate the ATP. So they're really, really critical for generating ATP. But what happens is if a deuteron gets in the mix, it basically gums up the pump, kind of like putting sugar in the gas tank. It damages the pump, and then the pump doesn't work well. It starts spewing out reactive oxygen. So it's incredibly important to the cell to keep the deuterons out of that intermembrane space where they're storing all these protons. There's all these mechanisms that try to keep deuterons out. And those mechanisms involve a lot of dehydrogenases, and glyphosate suppresses dehydrogenases almost as an entire class. I've seen many, many examples of glyphosate suppressing dehydrogenases. And so just that one class of enzymes dehydrogenases to be suppressed by glyphosate. And succinate dehydrogenase is an example. Causes the mitochondria a lot of stress because the extra deuterium gets into those pumps and breaks them. And I think that's central to glyphosate's toxic mechanisms. That effect.
Yeah, so it
A little bit of science there,
yeah,
but
who's ever listening is going to probably have to replay that like 5 or 6 times to get it. I know even for me, biochemistry was not a good subject for me. I was much better at the hands-on stuff,
it's a hard
anatomy.
topic.
It is. It's
It's really hard, and I'm actually struggling with it myself right now. I keep reading more and more and getting more and more knowledge, but the more I learn, the more I realize how hard it is. It's really hard, biochemistry. So I don't have a complete handle on it by any means, but I'm fascinated by it, and I've read a lot of stuff, and so I'm making sense out of it.
so basically what I'm hearing you say is the glyphosate's causing the mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondrial dysfunction is probably to blame for almost every health problem that we're seeing.
I think so. I think so. Yeah, all these chronic diseases. Yeah,
So we
the
need to,
mitochondria are so crucial.
yeah, so we need to, so number one, we need to stop glyphosate. That's got to
Yeah,
be our number one priority. But number two is how do we help people heal? How do we heal the mitochondria, that have already been damaged? Is it something that's
right.
reversible or is it that our
Well, there
bodies
are
just,
things you can do. Yeah.
okay, so what do you
And
suggest?
mostly it's eating good food. I really think that's so important, not just organic, but also whole foods. Like don't eat any soy protein bars, don't eat candy bars, eat whole foods, eat lots of fruits and vegetables. And I really support eggs. Eggs are super healthy, organic eggs. And and grass-fed beef, meats and eggs, and especially seafood, fish. Fish is a really good source of taurine, and taurine is a really interesting sulfur-containing amino acid that I feel is very important. And taurine is only present in animals, not in plants, with the one exception of seaweed, Japanese seaweed. So that's interesting. It's the only plant that has taurine. And I've written a lot about taurine. Taurine is a sulfur-containing amino acid, and the gut microbes can use it very well to help out with the sulfate problem. So I am a big fan of taurine, and taurine is high concentrations in deep sea fish, the big fish, and also it's present in eggs and meats and seafood. They are all really good sources of taurine.
So
Um,
if people throw
just
away their junk food, they throw away the box food, start eating whole foods, plus
yes,
with the understanding that our body's constantly making new cells, right? So if we take
yes,
that knowledge that our body's making new cells, we start feeding it good food
exactly.
that doesn't have glyphosate, that we can start repairing our bodies.
Right. And you want to make sure to get enough minerals and vitamins, and that's where like the fresh fruits and vegetables have lots of vitamins and minerals. And as I said, the seafood is very rich in vitamins and minerals. And so it's really just eating things that you recognize as foods, as opposed to, so when you have a soy protein bar, you look at the ingredients and there's a lot of them. Most of them look like chemicals.
Right,
You can be sure that that's not a good food
right.
to eat. The heavily processed foods, you just have to avoid those altogether. And I also recommend eating lots of herbs and spices. That's something I've really gotten into lately, especially fresh. When I was a child, we had my father liked to use herbs, like oregano and cinnamon, all these different spices actually. But it was always in a jar. It was a powder in a jar. And I actually didn't even understand that you could go to the store and buy a fresh version of these things, like fresh oregano or fresh basil and coriander and dill. I've really been enjoying lately buying those fresh and using them in cooking. They have a lot of antioxidants, very special polyphenolic compounds that are produced by these plants that are very, very healthy for you. And they help to mop up those reactive oxygen species that are damaging mitochondria. So I think, and even spices as well, and of course the Indian food is so wonderful. It has all these different
Oh,
spices like the
yeah.
curry powder. And we've become very keen on herbs and spices to really spice up our food. And of course it tastes delicious too. Once you start to experience these sort of enhanced foods, you really don't want to go back to the boring stuff that that just has salt and pepper, for example, you know. So I really encourage that idea of using herbs and spices in your food. And then, of course, fermented foods is another really important one. And prebiotics is another one. Prebiotics, I've become more keen on those lately because this just means like a lot of fiber. So fiber containing foods, like an apple, for example. Fiber gets converted into butyrate by the gut microbes. And butyrate is like the food of the gods as far as the melanocytes are concerned. So the cells that line the colon, they love butyrate. It's a short chain fatty acid. And you can see there's a lot of papers coming out showing that low butyrate is associated with various gut problems like inflammatory bowel disease and
Hmm.
even colon cancer. So the cells lining the gut will stay healthy if they can get a lot of butyrate, and they use that butyrate. They metabolize it, and make ATP out of it. And if they don't have a lot of butyrate, they're not happy. And it's been shown experimentally that glyphosate disrupts the microbes that are responsible for making the butyrate, and also that glyphosate reduces the amount of acetate that's been shown experimentally. It raises the pH and it reduces the amount of acetate. A higher pH is not good for making butyrate because butyrate, I wrote about this in my book. I have a chapter on the gut. I studied the gut really hard when I wrote that chapter, and I was very pleased with what I figured out because it looks to me like glyphosate disrupts the pH of the gut, making it too high. And then the acid-loving microbes don't thrive. And those are the ones that make the acetate, and the acetate gets converted to butyrate. So you end up with a deficiency in both acetate and butyrate when you have chronic glyphosate exposure because the pH is too high. And of course, that also encourages the growth of pathogens because those healthy microbes are not thriving. Pathogens grab a foothold. Now you've got inflammatory bowel disease, and you end up with, eventually you can end up with colon cancer.
I do want to mention that one of the nice things about herbs is they're easy to grow inside. So
Mm,
if you don't have any land to start growing herbs on your land, you could get little pots and grow them inside, set them on a windowsill. So that way you can have the fresh herbs available to you.
that's extremely nice.
Yeah.
That's really a good idea. Yeah.
So I have one last question for you. I see that we're running out of time. So, and we may have to come back to finish this question. So, do you think it's the gluten or do you think it's the glyphosate?
I'm almost positive it's the glyphosate.
Yeah.
We didn't have a problem with gluten before we had glyphosate in the gluten. And of course, wheat is sprayed right before harvest. Many wheat-based foods have tested positive for glyphosate. Zen Honeycutt has found it, of course, in the Girl Scout cookies, 100%. She looked at, I think, 40 different samples of Girl Scout cookies, 100% had glyphosate contamination. Wheat is just a really big problem in our country because of this practice of spraying it right before harvest. And I actually have studied gluten intolerance. I even published a paper on it. And we showed, in fact, that the rise in glyphosate usage on wheat, we usually we're using corn and soy, but you can get the data on wheat as well. And when you look at the rise of glyphosate usage on wheat over time, which is different from the way it was used on corn and soy, it matches very well with the rise in celiac disease. So it correlates better with the wheat than it does with the corn and soy, which
Right.
really kind of points to the wheat as being the problem with the gluten. And in fact, the glyphosate disrupts the microbes that actually help you to break down the gluten, because gluten has a lot of proline, and proline is a difficult amino acid to separate from the other guys when you're breaking down the protein. It requires special enzymes, and the microbes provide those special enzymes that help you to break down the gluten. So what happens is those microbes get killed by the glyphosate, then the gluten doesn't get broken down. You have these peptides that survive, and those peptides are toxic. And they end up causing autoimmune disease because your immune cells develop antibodies to those toxic peptides that are there because the gluten wasn't properly metabolized in the gut, and that's because the microbes were not there to do their job.
Right.
And so I think that's how you get gluten intolerance.
And I do think though there's also so I used to really love supplements. To me they were like this quick fix. I could take a handful of supplements, I'd recommend them to my patients. And then one day, really started learning about leaky gut and the inflammation in the gut. I realized that people may not be breaking down these supplements and in fact could be causing more problems. And I just want to circle back to this idea of eating whole foods to get the nutrients that you need, rather than thinking that handful of supplements is going to fix the problem. So to be aware and to reduce the inflammation in the gut is so critical. And then, take that one step further by like monitoring, like how are you doing as you introduce more whole foods and get rid of the processed foods.
Right. And in a sense, supplements are severely processed foods, right? They're extremely processed when it's just pure glycine. And actually, though, I do know people who recommend taking glycine as a supplement, which has a motivation because glycine can beat out glyphosate. Glyphosate is getting into the proteins, I believe, in place of glycine. And so if you have plenty of glycine, it'll be less likely for glyphosate to mess up your proteins. So I've heard from practitioners who have told me that they have found a benefit for their patients in supplementing with glycine. Not that I would do it because I would rather eat something that has a lot of glycine in it, such as bone broth. Bone broth is really good for the glycine.
Right. Well, Stephanie, I learn something new every time I talk to you.
Thank you.
And I hope anybody listening or watching this has learned something new. And I will post a bunch of links so you can read up on Dr. Seneff's papers and how to find her book. And hopefully, that will give you the information you need to do for you to do your own research on your own. So I want to thank you again for sharing your time and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.